Europe did not wake up to explosions or collapsing buildings. There were no sirens, no smoke rising above the skyline, no visible enemy to point at. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. A slow, creeping silence, the kind that only appears when the machinery of everyday life begins to hesitate. In 1973, the engines of Europe started to cough, not because they were broken, but because the invisible blood of modern civilization, oil, was being quietly withdrawn. This was not an accident, and it was certainly not a natural shortage. What unfolded was deliberate, calculated, and cruelly precise. Somewhere far from European capitals, behind closed doors thick with smoke, memory, and resentment, oil was no longer discussed as a commodity. It was redefined as a weapon, not a blunt one meant to punish the entire West, but a sharp blade designed to cut exactly where the pain would echo the loudest. The Netherlands was chosen. On paper, it made little sense. A small country with no vast armies, no imperial swagger, no oil fields of its own. Yet that was precisely the point. The Netherlands was wealthy, efficient, and morally confident. It spoke clearly when others whispered, openly supporting Israel after the Yom Kippur War, while the rest of Europe hid behind carefully polished ambiguity. In a world where energy had become leverage, such honesty was not admirable. It was dangerous. Rotterdam, Europe's great oil artery, suddenly transformed from a symbol of prosperity into a fatal weakness. The valves began to tighten, slowly enough to deny panic, but firmly enough to ensure suffering. Across the continent, governments watched. Some expressed concern. Others began to calculate, because everyone understood what this truly was. Not a dispute over barrels and prices, but a lesson in obedience. Imagine living in a world where the lights stay on, the streets remain intact, and yet everything feels precarious. Nothing has exploded, but you sense that it could at any moment simply stop working. That was the realization creeping through Europe's spine. Power had changed its shape. It no longer marched in uniform or spoke through cannons. It arrived silently, in tankers and contracts, and it had decided that comfort itself was conditional. To understand why this blow landed so deeply, you have to step back into the illusion Europe was living inside before the shock. The decades after the Second World War had taught Europeans a comforting lesson, that history had been tamed, empires had collapsed, borders had stabilized, and prosperity, steady, predictable prosperity, seemed to flow naturally from trade, cooperation, and institutions. War, at least between major powers, felt obsolete. Power was no longer seized. It was negotiated. Oil made that illusion possible. Cheap, abundant energy poured in from distant deserts, turning ruined cities into glittering capitals and factories into engines of endless growth. Europe did not conquer the Middle East. It consumed it. Tankers replaced armies. Contracts replaced colonies. And in this new order, dependency felt safe because it was mutual, or so it seemed. No country embodied this belief more perfectly than the Netherlands. Small, pragmatic, and ruthlessly efficient, it had mastered the art of being indispensable without appearing dominant. Rotterdam became the beating heart of Europe's energy system, a vast, humming gateway where oil arrived, was refined, redistributed, and quietly transformed into motion, heat, and wealth for millions who never questioned where it came from. The Dutch told themselves a simple story. They were not powerful, they were useful. They did not rule, they facilitated. In a world supposedly governed by rules and alliances, that felt like the safest position of all. If everyone depended on you, no one would dare to hurt you. But dependency, when examined closely, is never symmetrical. Beneath the surface of European unity lay a dangerous assumption that access to energy was permanent, that suppliers would always value revenue over revenge, and that politics could be neatly separated from pipelines. The Netherlands stood at the center of this fantasy, believing that commerce had replaced coercion and that moral clarity carried no price. History was about to remind them otherwise, quietly, methodically, without firing a single shot. The illusion shattered in October 1973, when a regional war detonated consequences far beyond its borders. The Yom Kippur War erupted with shocking speed as Arab forces struck Israel on its most sacred day. Tanks burned, soldiers fell, and diplomats rushed to microphones, pretending they still controlled the narrative. But the real decisions were not being made on the battlefield. They were being made elsewhere, in rooms without flags or press statements where memory ran long, and patience was finally exhausted. For years, the oil-producing states of the Arab world had watched the industrial powers lecture them about markets, stability, and restraint, while quietly assuming that the flow of oil was guaranteed. Revenue would always matter more than pride, the West believed. Dependency could be managed. Pressure could be absorbed. That belief was the true provocation. In those closed rooms, a line was crossed. Oil would no longer be neutral. It would no longer be merely sold. It would be aimed. The brilliance and the cruelty of the plan lay in its restraint. This was not a blanket embargo meant to shock everyone equally. That would have united the West. Instead, the embargo was selective, surgical, and deeply political. The goal was not chaos, it was discipline, a warning written in shortages rather than speeches, and so names were discussed, lists were drawn, allies were weighed, not by friendship, but by usefulness and symbolism. The Netherlands stood out immediately. Not because it was the strongest, but because it was visible. Because it had spoken when others hid behind careful silence. Because punishing it would send a message without triggering immediate retaliation. When the decision was finalized, there was no dramatic announcement, no thunderous declaration of a new era. The taps were simply turned, slightly at first, then more firmly. Tankers were rerouted, contracts were suspended, paperwork became a weapon, and somewhere between a port schedule and a diplomatic cable, the Netherlands was marked. Europe barely noticed at first. Crises were supposed to announce themselves loudly. This one whispered. But in that whisper was something far more dangerous than war. Intent. The question that spread quietly through European capitals was simple and deeply unsettling. Why the Netherlands? Why a country with no imperial ambitions, no armies on foreign soil, no oil fields to threaten or seize? The answer lay not in power, but in posture. In a world governed by careful ambiguity, the Netherlands had committed the unforgivable sin of clarity. While much of Europe responded to the Yom Kippur War with calibrated language and diplomatic fog, the Dutch government spoke plainly. Support for Israel was not disguised as neutrality or humanitarian concern. It was stated publicly, morally. In another era, such honesty might have been celebrated. In 1973, it made the Netherlands an ideal target. Rotterdam sealed its fate. The port was not merely a harbor, it was the throat through which Middle Eastern oil passed to feed Western Europe. Every tanker that docked there carried more than crude. It carried leverage. By striking the Netherlands, the embargo did not just punish a single nation. It threatened the rhythm of an entire continent, while preserving plausible deniability. The Dutch assumed that their role as Europe's indispensable middleman would protect them. After all, hurting the Netherlands meant hurting everyone. Surely the alliance would close ranks. Surely principles would outweigh convenience. This belief was not naive. It was logical, if one still believed that alliances were built on solidarity rather than survival. Reality proved colder. As the embargo tightened, the Netherlands waited for pressure to build from within Europe, for collective outrage, for a unified response. Instead, What arrived was silence. Concern was expressed in public. Sympathy was offered in private. But behind closed doors, calculations were already underway. Energy was becoming scarce, and scarcity has a way of stripping ideals down to their barest utility. The Netherlands had not misread its enemies. It had misread its friends. And that realization, still faint but growing sharper by the day, was far more devastating than the loss of oil itself. The true weight of the embargo revealed itself not in diplomatic cables, but in daily life. At first, the changes felt manageable, almost symbolic. Fuel deliveries were delayed. Prices crept upward. Officials reassured the public that the situation was temporary, controllable, rational. But energy crises do not announce their arrival all at once. They seep in, quietly, until normality begins to feel like a memory. Then the streets changed. Cars disappeared. Entire cities fell into an eerie stillness as the Netherlands introduced car-free Sundays, not as a protest, but as a necessity. Highways once filled with motion became empty corridors, stretching into silence. The modern world, so proud of its speed and efficiency, suddenly looked fragile, as if a single missing ingredient had exposed the lie beneath the miracle. Factories slowed, productivity faltered. Economic statistics, once abstract and comforting, turned hostile. Inflation surged, growth stalled, confidence evaporated. Each missing shipment of oil translated into jobs at risk, livelihoods paused, futures deferred. This was not suffering on the scale of war, but it carried a uniquely modern terror. The fear that everything depended on systems no one could truly control. Across the border, Europe watched carefully. Officially, there was unity. Privately, there was panic. Governments understood what was at stake, and more importantly, who was being tested. The Netherlands was not just enduring an embargo, it was serving as a demonstration. What followed was a moral fracture, subtle but decisive. As oil grew scarce, the question was no longer whether the embargo was unjust, but whether it could be outlasted without personal sacrifice. And in that moment, Europe hesitated. Because when survival enters the equation, principles become negotiable. And the embargo was designed to exploit that weakness with ruthless precision. The breaking point did not arrive with a public collapse or a dramatic announcement. It came quietly, in the form of transactions that were never meant to be seen. While the Netherlands endured rationing and paralysis, something else began to move across Europe. Oil, with altered identities, rerouted tankers, contracts rewritten in careful language. The embargo was being obeyed in theory and dismantled in practice. This was the moment of betrayal. European allies, bound by treaties and shared values, discovered how flexible those bonds became when energy security was at risk. Oil meant warmth, transportation, political stability. It meant survival. And so one by one, governments found ways around the restrictions. Crude oil changed flags on paper. Shipments passed through intermediaries. Everyone maintained the performance of solidarity while quietly stepping out of line. The Netherlands watched this unfold with a mixture of disbelief and dawning clarity. The punishment was never meant to be shared equally. That was the point. The embargo worked because it tempted others to defect. Unity would have blunted its force. Self-interest sharpened it. This was the true climax of the crisis, more devastating than empty fuel stations or silent highways. The Dutch were not being crushed by an enemy. They were being isolated by friends. The embargo had exposed an unspoken hierarchy within Europe, where some nations could bend the rules while others paid the price for principle. In the end, no shots were fired, no borders crossed, yet the damage was profound. Trust, once lost, does not return with the flow of oil. The Netherlands had become the cautionary tale, the proof that alliances fracture first, not under attack, but under temptation. What emerged from the wreckage was a new understanding of power, one that required no conquest and left no ruins to photograph. the embargo revealed a method of control far more efficient than force. The ability to shape behavior by manipulating dependence. No tanks rolled across borders. No capitals fell. Yet governments adjusted their positions, softened their language, and learned to speak more carefully. This was conquest, without occupation. By simply restricting flow, the oil-producing states demonstrated that sovereignty in the industrial age had limits. Nations could fly their flags, pass their laws, and hold their elections. But as long as their economies depended on external energy, their freedom was conditional. The embargo did not demand surrender. It invited compliance. Europe absorbed the lesson quickly. Foreign policy became quieter, more ambiguous, more transactional. Moral positions were no longer statements of belief. They were risks to be managed. Support was offered in whispers, neutrality dressed up as balance, and principles recalibrated to avoid provoking the invisible hand on the valve. The Netherlands felt this shift most acutely. Survival required adaptation, not defiance. The country learned that being right offered no protection if it meant standing alone. Power, it turned out, belonged not to those who spoke clearly, but to those who controlled the terms of silence. What made this form of domination so effective was its deniability. No one appeared defeated. Life gradually resumed. Oil returned. But the rules had changed. The message had been delivered, absorbed, and internalized. And the world moved on, pretending nothing fundamental had happened. When the oil finally returned, it did not restore what had been lost. Tankers resumed their routes, refineries came back to life, and traffic slowly reclaimed the empty highways. But Europe emerged altered in ways that were difficult to name and impossible to reverse. The crisis did not end with resolution. It ended with adaptation. Governments rewrote their priorities in silence. Energy security moved from technical concern to political obsession. New agencies were created, reserves stockpiled, contingency plans drafted. For futures no one wanted to imagine, but everyone now feared. Publicly, Europe spoke the language of cooperation and balance. Privately, it learned the discipline of caution. The Netherlands survived, but survival came at a cost. The illusion of moral insulation was gone. Being indispensable had not guaranteed protection. Being principled had not earned loyalty. What remained was a colder realism, one that recognized how quickly a nation could be isolated if it disrupted the equilibrium of dependence. Across Europe, the lesson spread without needing to be taught. Foreign policy grew smoother, less confrontational, more evasive. Words were chosen not for clarity, but for safety. Silence became a tool. Ambiguity became a shield. The crisis had trained an entire generation of leaders to ask not whether something was right, but whether it was sustainable. This was the quiet catastrophe. No monuments were built to mark it. No treaties signed to acknowledge it. Yet from that moment on, Europe carried an invisible scar, a permanent awareness that prosperity rested on forces beyond its control. The embargo had ended, but its shadow settled in for the long term. History rarely ends with explosions. More often it ends with adjustments so subtle they feel like maturity rather than surrender. The Arab oil embargo did not destroy Europe. It educated it. And education, when delivered through pain, has a way of reshaping behavior long after the lesson is over. The Netherlands was never meant to collapse. It was meant to be remembered, a controlled burn, carefully watched by the rest of the continent. The message was not shouted, but it was unmistakable. Power in the modern world no longer needs to conquer territory. It only needs to control the systems that make daily life possible. From that moment on, Europe spoke differently. Not more wisely, more carefully. Alliances became conditional. Principles became negotiable. And energy, once assumed to be a neutral backdrop of progress, was recognized for what it truly was: Leverage disguised as necessity. Here is the uncomfortable truth history leaves behind. The embargo worked, not because oil was scarce, but because unity was. Because when forced to choose between solidarity and survival, most nations hesitate. And hesitation is enough. So when you hear modern leaders speak about stability, diversification, resilience, ask yourself what they are really afraid of losing. The tools may have changed. Oil, gas, semiconductors, supply chains, data. The mechanism remains the same. History is not repeating itself because we forgot 1973. It is repeating itself because we learned the wrong lesson. The world did not stop using oil as a weapon. It simply learned how to use it more quietly.